It's Ulysses. Today we're going to be talking about themes in Ulysses. So Vladimir Nabokov, who you probably know is the author of Lolita and other books, he wrote, or he had published, I don't know if they were published in his lifetime, but there were 3 books collecting his lectures when he was a professor teaching English and stuff at Wellesley College in Cornell. And one of the books it's like just on Don Quixote, one's on Russian literature, and one is like on mainly English literature. So that's the one that has about 100 pages devoted to Ulysses. And he says that the themes, or the main theme of Ulysses, is the hopeless past, the ridiculous and tragic present, and the pathetic future. And as exciting and upbeat as that sounds, I'm going to those you can probably find in the book as well, but I'm going to dispute that and find my own themes, which I think are you can find if you're looking, or maybe some of them are pretty obvious, but some of them are a little more subtle. So I will highlight them, and you can, as you read, look for these themes in your adventures. So Joyce is telling a very specific story at a very specific time. It involves, Ireland, Catholic Ireland, but he takes the specific instances to relate something that is very general, that I think he wanted to be relatable by everybody. So even though it is a very specific story, the 3 big things that he's talking about, I think, or that he's paying tribute to, are love, creativity, and freedom. And these 3 main characters, too, that I mentioned in the last video, you can kind of see them as each embodying one of those qualities, but I think they all contain all 3 of them, and everybody does in different ways. So this is, I think throughout this book, you're going to see him attempting to explain and put these ideas before you. So love, creativity, and freedom. Those are, you could say that Stephen is creativity and that Bloom is maybe freedom and Molly is love, or some combination like that. But I think it's a little more complicated, and if you start looking at it, though, you'll see it in every chapter on every page. This is also a book about storytelling. I mean, obviously it's one big story, but within the story, there's pretty much every scene that has conversation. You're going to find people telling stories about, news events, telling jokes. A lot of the songs that they include are stories on themselves. And you're going to see stories told in different ways. And also the emerging media forms that Joyce was experiencing in the early 1900s, like movies, I think he includes those. Even though this is a book, he tries to include those techniques in different ways into the book. I was recently informed that the Choose Your Own Adventure books that were popular in the 1980s, on the page in Wikipedia, it actually references Ulysses, and I could kind of see that maybe being connected to the Wandering Rocks episode of the book, in which Joyce will follow one character for a little, and then he'll jump back in time and follow another character along a different path. So this idea of forking paths and intersections, I think that's something that he was interested in, and he wanted to try and do something new with storytelling, and I think he does, and not just that way, but in a lot of other ways that we'll see. And connected to the idea of storytelling, this is a book also filled with a lot of fake news, rumors, gossip, and things that are just not true, or there's so many instances. I'll point some of them out when we do the episodes, but there's so many instances of people seeing another character and seeing them a certain way, and that just biases their thinking, and they see things totally incorrectly. For example, one instance when Bloom is on the beach and he's watching this woman, Gertie McDowell, and they're watching each other. You get to see inside her brain, and she imagines that he's some exotic foreign gentleman, when in fact he's not a foreigner. He's lived in Ireland all his life, and it's kind of funny that that's just one small instance. But you're going to see many other cases, like the way that people see Bloom, especially because he's Jewish. They're always making these stereotyped Jewish images out of him, and you'll see it in a lot of ways. But also Stephen too, and Molly, and most of the characters. For instance, at the end of the book, when Molly is picturing Stephen, she just imagines him as a little more glamorous, I think, than he is. And there's just a lot of funny innuendos that Joyce will imply and make use of. But that connects also to one of my favorite authors commenting about Ulysses was Robert Anton Wilson. He was really the one that got me interested in the book, and he uses the term reality tunnels. We may use different terms nowadays with the internet, like filter bubble, or there was another term, funnel, I can't remember. Anyways, I'm blanking, but it kind of leads to the same idea: disinformation, fake news, storytelling, creating and sending people into these alternate realities, and that everybody in the city is living in their own reality. And because Joyce jumps through points of view, there's at least I can think of five first-person narration point of views in the book. Stephen, Bloom, Molly, the citizen in the bar scene, and Gertie McDowell. There may be others that I can't think of off the top of my head. But also there's, narrator, third-person, omniscient narrator, and Joyce will play with the narration in so many ways, especially in chapters like Oxen of the Sun. He shows that each narration and each point of view has its own bias, and I think that's something that he didn't really use in the earlier storytelling methods of things like Dubliners or even A Portrait of the Artist. He doesn't shift point of views. He primarily gives one point of view, or even if it's like A Portrait of the Artist, where it's mainly Stephen's perspective, even though it's in the third person, it's still one point of view throughout the book for the most part. This book is also about families and what families mean and what relations and connections mean and how we are related to each other. I don't know, there's so many different ways to address that, and that's very general, but I think that if you didn't comment on it, you'd be neglecting a major theme that Joyce is touching on in the book. One of my favorite characters in the book is Simon Daedalus, the father of Stephen Daedalus, and I would say he's probably the fourth most significant character in the book after the three that I mentioned before, because even though we don't get to see his interior monologue like we do with the other three characters, we do get to see his perspective a lot, and we also get to see different sides of his personality. Joyce is very... he doesn't like to show people as either good or bad. He likes to really show them as fluctuating, and change is another major theme in the book. People are always changing, and everything's in flux throughout the book. Each chapter has its own feeling. Later on I'll talk about these schemas that Joyce used, but I think it's pretty obvious that at different times of the day our body is responding differently to our environment. We have, a circadian rhythm. We have the way that the places that we're in, and how we interact with others. It's always changing, and Joyce is very keen on showing that. So Simon Daedalus, at some points, he seemed like kind of a nice guy, a sympathetic character. In the Sirens chapter, for instance, when he's singing, he seems like a good sport, like with the other guys that are singing and playing music. But then in some scenes, he seems like he's kind of a dick. So it's not simple, and I think Joyce realized that people aren't simple. Another huge theme that I think you can see is this whole Joseph Campbell mythology aspect. And I said it's based, loosely on Odysseus, but that's just a starting point for Joyce's own storytelling. But he does realize that, I think Joyce does try to show that we all live in this mythological way, even though our adventures may not be as exotic as Odysseus facing monsters and gods and stuff. We still have these experiences that are transformative in the same way, and that can seem just as scary, just as exciting and adventurous. I think that is something that Joyce was keenly aware of. I'm not a huge fan of Joseph Campbell's books, but I do like his speeches, his talking. He's like The Power of Myth, that series he did with Bill Moyers. That's pretty good. And I don't know if he talks about Joyce much in that series. I can't remember. It's been a while, but I think it is worth a listen, and just a knowledge of myth and the enjoyment of myth, and the idea of how these forces work even in the most common of human lives. one final angle or theme that I'm going to leave you with is the media aspect. I mentioned Marshall McLuhan, and I would recommend some kind of exposure to McLuhan's thought. He's a pretty interesting guy, and he has several books, but like Campbell, I kind of prefer his spoken word stuff. Although one of his books is illustrated. It's called The Medium is the Massage. That's a pretty cool book. You can read it really like an hour or less probably. It's almost like a comic book that I think, though, like he messed around with like film. There's plenty of stuff on YouTube of his speeches. Just find some exposure to Marshall McLuhan, because for him, McLuhan, like he said that every time we use a different medium, we actually have a different experience. These are ways of extending our nervous system, our consciousness. And Joyce, it's very subtle if you're not looking for it. I think you might miss it, because it's something that Joyce doesn't hit you over the head with. It comes up slowly through the book as characters interact with things like novels. Like in the beginning of the book, Molly Bloom she's looking for a new kind of smutty erotica novel, and you kind of see that the way that she experiences the world is similar to that. It's just like Gertie McDowell, like who, through these advertisements that she's been bombarded with and the novels that she reads, she kind of sees the world in that similar way. And Bloom, who's working with media extensively, he works with the newspapers and with advertisements, he's a little cynical about it. He has kind of a little different perspective, but even he is subject to these forces. But also I think about, when I think about media, it's kind of an image of something maybe similar to that you'll see in A Portrait of the Artist, that the artist is somebody who creates this creature, much like in the Bible, God creating Adam or creating humanity. And once he creates it, the artwork, he releases it into the world, and it has a life of its own. I think Joyce also plays on that. So those are some of the major themes that I see in the book. If you have any ideas about what the themes are, feel free to comment in the comments below, and I will see you in the next video.